everyone, and welcome back to Rebel Eaters Club with Commentary, Episode 4, Bye Bye Diets with Chef Fresh Roberson. And we're listening to the second part today, and let's just jump into it.
We're back. When we free ourselves from diet culture, we get to honor who we are and what we want. And we can finally start poking holes in the oppressive systems that keep us feeling trapped. The systems that built diet culture in the first place. Chef Fresh thinks about this stuff too. I asked them how they understand the connection.
I think about how food and our relationship to food has just been so complicated and has shifted so much, especially from looking back. And I think about what did my ancestors eat? What did people eat, and what was it like before, that long ride over here?
Yeah.
And what was this land like, and what does this land grow, and what was all of that like before, white folks came and definitely destroyed and shifted things quite a bit.
Yeah. How do you see the connection between our cultural relationship to food and these very old entities like colonialism, racism, the history of this culture?
Wow. I think around colonization and white folks coming and destroying crops and bringing in the things they were experienced with growing, and how that shifted these culturally relevant foods that were important to us. And then even now thinking about how that impacts what foods are good foods to eat now or bad foods to eat. And often in the bad category falls these culturally significant foods for me that that my parents and grandparents and ancestors have grown up eating and brought over, and how colonization and all of that has ripped that apart. So ripping that food away, but then also giving you this image and body to aspire to, and don't eat these foods that are culturally significant for you.
Yes, I mean, I want to get into that.
Okay, I'm sorry. Normally I try not to comment so much on race stuff, but this definitely feels like a fucking reach. Anything that's designated as an unhealthy food, or if you really want to go with no nuance, the bad food. I'm not saying that there aren't culturally significant foods that fall into this. Fried bread is definitely one that falls into the unhealthy food category because it's fried. It's literally fried dough. It's just not good for you. There's also plenty of European foods though that fall into this category. A croissant isn't very good for you. It's not. It's delicious, but it's a full stick of butter in a croissant recipe. There's plenty of Western European foods that fall into the bad foods category as well. It's not that this was just some conspiracy to demonize foods from other cultures. Any food that is marked as bad, and it's not even really marked as bad, it's often marked as unhealthy, so eat in moderation. It's because it contains high levels of sodium, sugar, or saturated fats. The food that is marked as unhealthy food, yeah, there's a lot of cultural dishes that fall into that because, I mean, for lack of a better term, unhealthy foods tend to be very tasty. They do. Healthy foods can be very tasty too. I'm not saying that they're not. I'm just saying that when it comes to that, humans tend to like food that's sweet, salty, and has a lot of fat content in it, which falls into a lot of cultural foods because those foods went pretty far, filled up a lot of people, and were commonly used for celebrations because they were decadent. So cultural foods do tend to fall into the unhealthy foods category, but that's not any demonizing of culture. Hell, if you're gonna blame Western ideologies, a lot of Asian foods actually fall into the healthier food categories because it tends to be a bigger emphasis on vegetables. But even then, there's plenty of Asian foods that also fall into the unhealthy category too. It's not a war on culture. It's just how things pan out when you actually take a critical look at the nutrient content of these foods and the deficits of these foods. Some foods will fall in unhealthy categories and some will fall in healthy categories, and that is true across cuisines. You fucking think Italian food, especially with pasta, is healthy? Those fall under the eat in moderation category too. So I just I don't typically comment on the racial aspect that they try to infuse with this fat acceptance stuff, but this is something that to me is just patently false. I'm sure there's some people that are racist that try to say these foods are bad for you strictly because they're from a different culture, but I think by and large, when you look at a big scope and you look at the health quality of these foods, it's not specific to any one culture. There's plenty of unhealthy foods across cultures. There's plenty of healthy foods across cultures. But I just wanted to chime in there.
That good food, bad food binary, right? Like you were already talking about the good fatty, bad fatty. I feel like it's so connected, right? But like this idea that all the things that are associated with your family and your lineage, that these things are things that when you're a person of color, you need to push away. And it's part of this, it's part of a big system of assimilation. And I think a lot of it has to do with like literally disconnecting and unmooring a person from who they are and where they come from. You know, growing up, I was raised in an immigrant household by my grandparents who are from Mexico. And my grandparents really encouraged me to become, an American. And they didn't teach me Spanish. And there was a lot of incentive for me to, become educated, which I think was this sort of code for assimilating as well as I could into the expectations of the culture that we were now a part of. And I remember the tension would show up in all these weird moments. Like,
so I actually do want to just, jump in again real quick, but that they really wanted you to get an education. I definitely think that the not teaching you Spanish was an assimilation thing because they want you to blend in with the culture a little bit more. But when it comes to getting a higher education, I don't think that that was necessarily in line with assimilation. I think that came more in line with the assumption that getting a higher level of education would allow you to get a better job, because that is that's a narrative that we get a lot. And there's a level of truth to it, although that the level of truth to it has shrunk as years have gone by, and you need a lot more education for not as great a pay as you would in generations prior. But I don't think that, like, the not teaching you Spanish, I think was to aid you in assimilation, but I think equating everything that your parents told you to this attempt at assimilation, anything that wasn't like deeply in your family culture, like if they wanted you to go outside of that culture, that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think they should have taught you Spanish, but they were doing what they thought was best for you at the time. I think, again, I don't know Virtie's family. There seems to be layers there that I'm not going to get into. But when it comes to the wanting education, most parents, regardless of race, want their children to get an education because it will facilitate their successful future. It's not just, I don't think that assimilation was the core of it there.
So the story that I was thinking of was, remembering these moments where I would go to the grocery store with my grandmother and I would feel really frustrated with her. And I would just, I would be like, how do you not know that some of this food is bad and some of the food is good? How do you not know that you're not supposed to we're not supposed to eat hot dogs, right? Like everybody knows these things are bad. And then as an adult, going back and thinking about that moment and realizing that in my grandmother's mind, she could not fathom a world in which somebody would intentionally put food with no nutrition into a store where you're supposed to be able to feed your family. And so she axiomatically was like, that doesn't make any sense, girl. And I'm coming from the place of like, I've already accepted this particular system of food and being and hierarchy as fact. And I am now treating her as someone who is intellectually inferior because I've accepted that. You know what I mean? It's like, it's just this kind of real, I feel like that story speaks to that tension so much.
That story.
That's also, to a certain extent, like, let's not fucking blame, diet culture or whatever you're trying to do here on just that. That happens for every child in every fucking family where they discover this thing and they think their other family member is stupid for not knowing it. It's not always food. Sometimes it's electronics. Sometimes it's pop culture. It doesn't really matter. Or sometimes it can be, like, I have family members that didn't graduate high school. So if I mention something and they don't know what it is, when I was younger, there was a level of intellectual superiority that I felt. To a degree, that also rests with the person, because I was desperate to be, like, the smartest person in the room, and that's part of it. As I've grown older and I've learned just the varying backgrounds of what other people are and how they've gotten to where they are and how not everyone starts from the same starting line. And even if you start from a similar starting line, you can end up gaining completely different information, and plenty of people have information that I didn't gain from the path that I ended up on. So you learn to value what other people bring to the table as you get older. And to a certain extent, as you become more educated and you realize the breadth of knowledge that exists in the world and how it's impossible for you to know everything. And so there's plenty of people that know things that you don't know. But when you're a child, that breadth of knowledge seems very narrow. And so it's like, how can you not know this when... I mean, I think to a certain extent that's just part of growing up, and I think that's part of being a kid and a teenager.
Very reminded me a lot of like, I grew up, in the South in Eastern North Carolina, and I remember like all of the animal gets used up. My grandfather farmed, and so my mom was like a part of like a certain type of culture in a certain type of way, and it was just like you use everything. And so she used to have these phrases like everything's chicken but the bill, and that's chicken still, which means you eat all the chicken. You eat everything pretty much except the beak, and I'm sure we can find a purpose for the beak too.
Yes.
And the same is definitely true of hogs. Like we would use the whole pig. Like I don't even know if there's a part of the pig that does not get used. You use all of it. Like you use the skin and the fat, you make lard. My mom would crisp up the skin. There would be like a whole pig on the, on the grill, like all of these things. And I remember very clearly like growing up, when I was in my like advanced courses with all of these white people, there were certain things that like they did not eat. It's like a lack of education. You don't eat that part. Having this like snotty, disrespectful energy toward like probably my mom or my family around like, oh, well, they just don't know or whatever,
Yes.
And I think it's like very much like rooted in like diet culture and like what we frame as like nutrition in this way of like, yeah, well, eat the chicken breast, but don't eat the chicken thigh.
Right.
Like you can eat the chicken breast, but you have to take the skin off, or like, in these ways that it's just not very conducive to what it was for like indigenous people, for like, Black folks, for like, Mexican folks to like really utilize and not have any waste. And so it's so interesting, like how all these things are so
I do, to a certain extent, understand what she's saying here. I do think that there is a lack of knowledge as to how much of an animal is actually edible. That being said, eat the chicken breast, but don't eat the chicken thighs. There's plenty of people that eat the chicken thighs. I'm not one, simply because I don't care for the texture of dark meat. I see what she's saying here. I do. I think to equate it strictly with whiteness is a little bit of a mistake, but because there's plenty of white people that learn to deal with the full animal. But America is pretty wasteful with the desirable pieces of the animal that we want to eat. I do see what she's saying here to a degree. And I don't really have a but there. There is a cultural expectation to a degree that, these are the acceptable parts of the animal, and then these other parts are gross when it's not very conducive to using the full animal. It's not very conducive to eliminating waste. There are certain parts where it's like, well, there's also more of a risk of bacteria with these parts, typically organs. And so I think that's part of where that comes from. And then part of it is just a foreignness because we have not... Americans are very separated. I think something that's worth noting, I can't say for other countries, but Americans are very separated from the parts of the animal that we see and then how that animal is processed. We see just like the prepackaged meat in the grocery store, so we don't see the full animal. We don't see... I think there's just this disconnect of education a little bit because Americans are so separated from their food. She mentioned how, the family, if they had an animal, they took care of the whole animal. I think that's probably still pretty true for people on farms. To a degree, I do understand what she's saying here.
interconnected.
When Chef Fresh was a kid, they saw how white people looked down on the way their family used whole chickens or whole pigs. But then, in recent years, using the whole animal has become trendy. And just as quickly, it could go out of vogue again. It's so arbitrary. And if you think about it, food trends tend to exploit the traditions of marginalized people. What I'm talking about here is racism, of course. But I want to get deeper into something I like to call racism's creepy grandpa: colonialism. First, a history lesson. Colonialism goes back a long way. When we're talking about the context here in the US, we're talking about a period that started in the late 1400s when imperial powers like Spain and Britain violently claimed entire regions without regard for the indigenous population's autonomy or humanity. Colonizers saw non-European beliefs as inferior. Speaking broadly, indigenous people, like many cultures all over the world, tended to believe the mind, body, spirit, and land were all interconnected, dependent on each other. Europeans largely believed in mind over matter and human domination over the natural world. I see this same worldview living on in diet culture. Let me explain. Under diet culture, people of all sizes and abilities aren't unique beings who are inherently valuable. They are units that we can quantify through metrics such as weight and body mass index. For instance, it blew my mind when I learned that there are people right now in cultures outside the West who have never even seen a scale. Under diet culture, food isn't something that connects us to the land and to each other. It is something we categorize as good or bad and quantify through a concept like the number of calories, grams of fat, and carbs.
No, again, Virgie's being over-reductive here and eliminating a lot of nuance. One, the fact that it surprised you that there are cultures outside the U.S. that don't have, where people haven't seen scales, that just speaks to your own fucking ignorance. Like, that's not diet culture, that's you being ignorant. Rather than blaming this perceived boogeyman that you have in your head, how about you accept that you were just ignorant and you didn't really see outside your own myopic little view of the world. It happens to all of us. It happens to, because we grow up in a culture and we think it's normal. And for us, it is normal, but normal is different across the world. Personally, when I was in my Japanese culture class, and we had traditional, there was a tatami mat, it had a tea room in the Japanese culture building, and we actually had a Japanese tea master come for a couple of weeks, and I got to participate in a traditional tea ceremony, and it was awesome. My legs also fell asleep, and it was so fucking painful, but that's beside the point. It was a very interesting experience, and also the tea was fucking hot. It was normal for my teacher and for the tea master for the tea to be that hot, granted, I don't tolerate hot things well to begin with, but my fucking god, was that hot. It felt like it scalded me all the way down. But it was normal for them. And for most Westerners, the level of hot that tea would be insane. But it's just a matter of a difference of perception of what is normal. It was too hot for me, but for my teacher, who was Japanese, it was a normal temp to have the tea at. This comes down to your level of ignorance, not some boogeyman preventing you from seeing the world as it really was. This is you gaining experience as you get older about other cultures. Let's stop pretending that because you weren't aware of something, that means there was some insidious mechanism behind you not knowing that. Everyone has holes in their education, be it academic, cultural, or social. We all have holes in those educations. And quite frankly, we'll probably continue to have holes that we don't even see up until we die. Because the world is just that big and cultures are just that diverse and just that nuanced. And there's just differences that we can't even begin to perceive because of the sheer expanse of these different traditions across these, at a minimum, these three categories. So it just irked me.
Diet culture is itself a series of traumatic events occurring over and over, each time shaving away the humanity of its practitioner a little more.
Oh, for fuck's sake. Are you kidding me? It's traumatic. It's traumatic and it takes away your humanity. Are you fucking kidding me? I don't even have any, cogent argument to go with that. It's just so ridiculous.
So how do we begin to recover? For Chef Fresh, part of the healing came from farming, reclaiming a relationship to the land. I asked them, what is it like for chefs when they're farming? What does it do for them? What does that healing look like?
For me, it feels like I also like puzzles. So like, puzzles are like very soothing. Like I put pieces together. I have like little mini celebrations when things fit and
Yes.
things. And then, like I feel like then I get to the end and it's like I'm missing a piece, or maybe I'm missing two pieces, or I'm missing like, a few pieces. And so like to me, like when I get to be in the dirt, it feels like I like found a piece. To me, I think what it is like there's something in the earth. There's something in the earth that is like very healing, that is connecting, that is a lesson to learn. And I think it feels like very much a connection to like ancestors. And there's something there, I think, that is around it as to why it just feels good to me. And it feels like powerful, right? Like it feels like, like I have this thing often, and I think people talk about it sometimes as like, zombie apocalypse, or like I also always frame it as like, zombie apocalypse, aka when white folks start acting a fool, like what am I going to have? How am I going to be prepared? And I think like when I think about things like that ability around growing things that I need to eat, being able to like, feed myself, feed my community, growing like herbs, growing like these things that like provide flavor and seasoning and like all of these things, but then also like that have medicinal qualities that like I can grow things that I need that like take care of my body and make it feel better, or that heals things that I need healed. Like there's something there in that experience too that just feels nourishing to me and makes me feel held.
Yes, I love that. I love that metaphor so much. I mean, I think that as I think about the long journey to recovering my relationship to food, I was struggling a lot, like thinking about, what do I want my relationship to foods like vegetables that used to like really like vegetables are weaponized against fat people in like a really big way. And so it is really a
Did she just say vegetables are weaponized against fat people in a really big... How do you weaponize vegetables? How? I'm sorry. How do you weaponize a vegetable? Because we say you should eat them? Because they're a high nutrient dense food?
a challenge, I think, for me to recuperate that experience and make the experience of like eating all.
And then she says, but she's not expanding on it at all. What do you mean that vegetables are weaponized against fat people? What the fuck does that mean?
All kinds of food, like something that feels really right and integrated and not triggering for me. And I think a lot of people don't realize this, right? For a lot of people, what some people might think of as like, oh, it's just simply a thing. It's just simply a carrot. It's just simply a salad. It's just simply whatever. Something that grew in the earth, right? And how twisted it is that I think for somebody like me who that food was used to hurt me. And so I have to do a lot of work to just...
What does that mean though? That it's just a salad. It's just a carrot, and that food was used because you were put on diets? Is that what they mean? Then isn't the diet that was weaponized against you, not the vegetables? This just seems like a justification to me to just eat crap food. It's a way of positioning yourself as a victim so that way you don't have to you don't have to be responsible for the choices that you make in the food that you consume. Well, vegetables were weaponized against me. That's why I can't eat them and I have to eat the donuts. This just seems very contrived.
It's not like I'm starting at zero. It's like I'm starting at -500 with this thing and then trying to build a road back to it. Right. And I kind of realized, like, for me, when I think back, like one of the most powerful teaching experiences I've had was working with, it was 2 Indigenous women, and it was like it was a focus on like meditation and healing and understanding the earth and our connection to the earth as part of recuperation. And they talked about the stones, like the stones and the plants being some of our oldest ancestors and how they hold all this wisdom and how they hold all this medicine. And for me, that became the road, right? Where I was like, oh my God, right? This lettuce that I'm going to have, or this carrot or this celery or this whatever, like this thing is coming from the wisest, oldest thing that we have access to on this planet, which is the earth, and like, this is not about some arbitrary version of like health, which is so connected to thinness and so connected to whiteness and so connected to able-bodiedness, right? This is my path to connecting to everything, right? Everything that lives, everything that has lived, everything that will live,
It's something that I want people to be able to have access to and get.
This just seems like, one, I find it unfortunate. I didn't quite catch, was it health or was it the idea of healthy food that she equated with whiteness? It just seems the healthy foods aren't necessarily connected to whiteness because there's plenty of foods from different cultures that are seen as healthy. It's a matter of what's nutrient dense based on science. And this idea that the earth is wise and that these foods come from the earth and therefore are products of this wisest and oldest being, which is the earth, is kind of a form of, for lack of a better term, mysticism, where it's like there's plenty of white-based religions that also follow that idea, paganism being a big one. I grew up pagan, and the solstices are around harvests, which celebrate what the earth has given us. And every Yule, which is a couple days before Christmas, there's that's the winter solstice. And because there is no harvest during the winter solstice, there's a harvest during the spring equinox, which marks like the first harvest. And then I believe, is it Beltane that's in May? I haven't celebrated the 8 Great Sabbats in a while. And then it's midsummer, and then there's another one before Mabon, which is the fall equinox, and then finally Samhain, which represents the final harvest of the year, and it's also Pagan New Year. And Samhain coincides with Halloween and All Saints Day. And actually, at least the way that I was raised, what happens is that it's when Samhain represents when the veil's thinnest. And actually, I'm not going to get into that whole thing because it's completely off the beaten path from what we're talking about here. But there is that mysticism of the earth is granting this for us, therefore we should honor it and honor the food that we're given from the earth. And another way that you honor the food that you're given is also like during Yule, during the winter solstice, where you put out an offering of food that you have, honey, and whatever, to feed Earth's creatures, because the Earth is asleep right now, and therefore it's your job as a human to take care of Earth's creatures in any way that you can. So it's not like that idea of food coming from the earth and that's why you honor it is not going against any sort of white-based religion at all. It's just not the Judeo-Christian religion. So I don't know. I try not to get too involved in the talks of race, but this is one that does bother me a little bit because I grew up in such an earth-based religion.
It and like, experience, even if it's briefly, like what healing, what connection they get if they get to like be even around plants or like be connected to the earth or put their hands in the dirt or whatever it is. I feel like it's definitely something that I want to be able to share with others. And I think about it in this way of like, how do I make it accessible? I had someone recently come out, like it's the day before Thanksgiving, and I was like harvesting the last little bits of stuff. And someone I met at No Lose came out and helped me harvest like the last of my sage and helped me harvest like the last of my things and sat in a chair and did that shit, right? Like we moved it along, like we made it work, and like, people sat down and like, picked sage, cut things, did what they needed to do. And I'm like, yes, this is like exactly what it is, like everybody can do it, like, no, and so I think about that a lot, and it just feels like this piece is missing, and I found it and I was able to fit it in there, and like, so.
Yes. Thank you so much for eating pecan pie with me and deconstructing colonialism with me, and talking about food.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
I love the image of Chef Fresh out there harvesting sage and using it to season the dishes they make for their community. That's what food is really about. It's not about calories and control. It's about pleasure, loving our bodies, healing our bloodline.
It's... What the fuck? Healing your bloodline? I was originally going to say, what is it with her preoccupation equating food with pleasure? Because food can serve multiple purposes, and viewing it strictly as a pleasurable act is what leads to a level of gluttony, and that's what makes it become unhealthy. But healing your bloodline, what in the fuck? Was that related to what they were talking about with getting reacquainted with it as something from the earth, and what that's the wisest... I don't know. It just... It's so frustrating.
And nourishing our relationships to each other, the planet, and the people whose bodies have been through a lot. After talking with Fresh, I kept thinking about puzzle pieces and that human drive for wholeness that we all possess. I went back to that story I told you about leaving my apartment and seeing the trees, the grass, the birds in Technicolor, and I realized that was one of the most significant decolonizing moments of my life. The puzzle...
See, what the fuck does that mean? That was the most significant decolonizing moments of my life because you took a fucking walk and appreciated... Are you fucking kidding me? This is why I struggle so much with the fat acceptance movement, is because they equate such mundane activities as taking a walk as though, one, no thin person does it, no cis person does it, no white person does it, and that it is somehow a revolutionary act. It's not. You took a fucking walk.
Puzzle came together that day. I could finally see this beautiful, incredible planet and my place within it. It was perfect. And if it was perfect, then I had to be perfect too, because we were connected completely. For today's journal prompt, write a breakup letter to diet culture. Maybe you're not ready to send it quite yet, but don't forget to list the reasons you can't keep letting this freeloading dirtbag take up precious real estate in your mind, body, and spirit. If you want to write down your thoughts, you can send it to us at rebeleatersclub@gmail.com or leave us a voicemail at 862-231-5386. And your story could make it onto the show. 862-231-5386.
All right, not sure if you guys want to do that. I wouldn't really recommend it. This is an episode from March of 2020, and I don't harass Virgie, don't harass the Rebel Eaters Club podcast. We're gonna end it there. Normally I try to respond to the prompts, but honestly this whole thing was kind of dumb. This prompt is dumb. I was never really part of diet culture. I mean, I guess maybe a little bit as a teen if you really want to get into it. Wanting to eat healthy, wanting to exercise, even wanting to lose weight is not necessarily a bad thing, I don't think. So, whatever. I'm going to leave it there. Let me know what you thought about this. I have a harder time responding to stuff that talks about colonialism and race just because feels like such a touchy subject and I don't want to cross any lines, but someone who's a bit better versed in this, if you want to chime in, I'd love to read it in the comments down below. Thank you for watching. I'm going to leave it here and I will see you next time.